It was barely past 6:15 in the morning, but the heat at Fort Chaffee already clung to everything. The air was thick with humidity, heavy enough to make uniforms damp by the time anyone finished formation. Staff Sergeant Avery Lane stepped off the gravel path and into the small concrete building marked ammunition storage facility. She had done this before. Same form, same procedure, same quiet exchange across the metal desk. Except this time, something was different. She handed over her ID and waited as the armorer scrolled through the manifest. He was young, maybe a corporal, maybe newer than the rifle slung over Avery's shoulder. His brow pinched slightly as he looked at the screen. Then he checked the clipboard, flipping back 2 pages, then forward again. He didn't look at her when he said the line that triggered something cold and familiar in her chest. Your lot is showing as delayed in the system, some kind of reroute. Logistics flagged it. Could be here by tomorrow. Might not. Avery didn't flinch. She asked for clarification. Which lot number? Who signed the last transfer? Was this flagged before or after her team's request was submitted to range control? The corporal stumbled through his notes, trying to sound confident. Something about a supply discrepancy report. Something about a request being elevated. No real answers. She nodded once. Not slowly. Not fast. Just enough to signal she'd heard what she needed. She stepped back into the sun. The heat hadn't gone anywhere. If anything, it pressed in harder now. Garrett was waiting near the Humvee, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting the edge of the range. He raised an eyebrow before she said a word. She gave him the update. Crisp and quiet. He didn't look surprised. Last night in the barracks, a few Marines had been laughing louder than usual. Something about fair chances. Something about resetting the board. Gunnery Sergeant Holt's name hadn't been mentioned. But it didn't have to be. He had a reputation that stretched farther than the Arkansas tree line. Winning mattered to him. So did making sure other people didn't. Avery didn't accuse anyone. She didn't swear. Didn't threaten. Didn't demand. She just said one thing, as she looked out over the range, the grass just beginning to shimmer under the rising sun. I've got a backup plan. Garrett didn't ask what she meant. He just gave a short nod and turned toward the barracks. That was the thing about trust. When it was real, you didn't have to explain everything. Behind her, the armorer was still typing, probably logging the conversation into a report that wouldn't go anywhere. Inside the warehouse, sealed crates of M2010 ESR rounds sat marked and untouched, waiting for paperwork that would never clear. Avery walked on without looking back. There would be no complaints filed, no fingers pointed. That wasn't her style. She'd seen too much to waste energy on fury. There was a fight coming, and if they wanted to start it by taking away her ammunition, they were going to learn what happened when you underestimated someone who had built herself from nothing. Avery grew up in a town so small, it didn't have a stoplight, just 2 gas stations, a post office, and a diner that closed at 3 every afternoon. The kind of place where the mail carrier knew your dog's name and half the houses had barns older than the families living in them. Hers was one of those houses, a white clapboard farmhouse tucked at the end of a gravel road, with a red barn out back that had been converted into something else entirely. Her grandfather had flown 8 seconds in the Air Force, then retired before she was born. By the time Avery came along, he had traded the cockpit for a workbench. The barn became his gunsmith shop. Stacks of brass cases lined the shelves beside tightly packed jars of powder. Rifle stocks leaned against the far wall, some wrapped in oilcloth, some still bare, waiting to be shaped. There was a drill press from the 70s and a scale that looked like it belonged in a high school chemistry lab. Nothing fancy, nothing fast. But everything in that shop worked because he had made it work. He started teaching her when she was barely tall enough to see the top of the bench. First, how to read a micrometer. Then, how to measure powder to the 10th of a grain. How to seat a bullet without scoring the case. How to crimp the mouth so smooth you could run a cotton swab over it and not feel a scratch. She didn't learn through lectures. She learned by doing, by watching his hands, by feeling how precision came from patience. Her father worked second shift at a machining plant down in the valley. He came home smelling like metal and coolant. Hands always nicked, but never idle. When Avery was 14, there was an accident. Something with a lathe. She didn't hear about it from him. She heard it from the sheriff who knocked on their door just after 7:15 a.m. The funeral was quick. There wasn't much money for anything more. Her mom started working 2 jobs. Her grandfather didn't say much in those days. But one afternoon, about a week after the service, he called her into the barn. He didn't talk about grief or loss or how the world had changed overnight. He just handed her a rifle, one of the custom bolt actions they'd built together, and pointed out toward a paper target nailed to a fence post 300 yards down the field. He told her to shoot. She asked why. He said because there were things in life she wouldn't be able to control, no matter how hard she tried. But there were other things she could, and when everything else fell apart, it helped to hold on to the ones you could. She fired 5 rounds. The group wasn't perfect, but it was tight. And in that moment, something clicked. Not the rifle. Her. Years later, in competition or on deployment, when people asked how she could stay so calm behind the glass, she never gave long answers. But in her mind, she always went back to that barn, that trigger, that day, because that was when she learned that precision wasn't just a skill, it was a way of surviving. Avery waited until just after 8:30 p.m. When the hallway outside the barracks had gone quiet and the last of the teams had turned in for the night, she locked the door behind her and crossed to the storage trunk at the foot of her bed. The metal latch gave a soft click as she opened it, revealing foam padding and a familiar set of tools nestled inside. Everything was there, exactly where she had packed it weeks before. The hand press sat in the corner, aged but sturdy. Its steel frame dulled from use. The digital scale blinked to life when she tapped it. A small box held her reloading Ds, each one wrapped in cloth. Brass cases, already cleaned and trimmed, were lined in rows inside a wooden tray. Match-grade bullets from Sierra, primers sealed in their factory sleeves. Some of these pieces had belonged to her grandfather. Others came from shooters who had long since aged out of the game. Every part had a story. Every part had a purpose. She didn't rush. That wasn't how this was done. She started by weighing each case, then she sorted them by weight into batches, no more than half a grain apart. The powder came next. She poured small amounts into the scale pan, letting it settle before brushing off the excess to hit exactly 42.6 grains. Not 42. Tsi. Not 42. Woo. That 10th mattered. It always had. She double-checked each charge before carefully funneling it into the case. Seating bullets came after. She adjusted the die so each round would sit at the exact depth tested in her rifle. Then came the crimp. Clean and even. No drag. No marks. The whole process took hours. But she never looked at the clock. The logbook sat open beside her. Each round was entered with full specs. Powder lot. Case weight. Cartridge length. Bullet batch. Room temperature. She logged it all, because if anyone questioned her, she would have answers, not excuses. By 2:10 a.m., she had loaded 75 rounds. That would cover the first day of shooting and leave some for chronograph testing. She laid the cartridges on a clean towel and looked at them for a long moment. Each one was quiet defiance. Each one said, "I didn't quit." She thought of the Marines laughing the night before. She thought of Holt and his smugness, the way he didn't need to say anything out loud for the message to come through. Then she thought of the barn, of her grandfather's voice telling her that control wasn't about force. It was about discipline. This was what control looked like. At 6:50 the next morning, she stood in front of Captain Miles and the range armorer with a box of hand-loaded rounds and her logbook in hand. Miles. A Marine, through and through. Didn't blink. He took the book, flipped through the pages, handed it to the armorer. They tested 10 rounds through the chronograph. The numbers came back tight, tighter than factory. The spread barely moved. The armorer looked at Miles. Miles looked at Avery. Then he gave a single nod. Approved for competition use. He made a note in the record and closed the book. Avery thanked them, turned, and walked away. She didn't need to say what came next. Her ammo was ready. Her rifle was clean. She had done her part. Now it was time to see who else had. The sun was barely over the tree line when Avery stepped onto the range. It was just past 6 o'clock in the morning, and the Arkansas air already felt like it had been wrung out over hot concrete. Humidity thick enough to press against her skin, heat rising off the gravel. A breeze drifted in from the north. Not enough to move the flags, but just enough to make her pay attention. She laid her M2010 enhanced sniper rifle across the shooting mat and knelt beside it. Garrett stood just behind her. Quiet. Focused. Already watching the mirage shimmer over the range. The known distance challenge was simple on paper. 10 shots. 600 yards. Best group wins. But nothing about the day felt simple. She ran one last function check. Cycled the bolt. Checked her data card. And chambered the first round. One of her own. Loaded by hand with powder measured to the 10th. A Sierra Match King seated to match her barrel's exact throat length. Not a factory round in the box. She took a deep breath. Let it out slow. And adjusted for the slight right to left wind. Garrett called out from behind her. His voice was calm, controlled. A confirmation of the trust they shared. They didn't need to say much. They never had. The range officer called the line hot. Avery settled into position, her cheek resting against the stock, her hand wrapping around the grip like it had 1,000 times before. She squeezed, steady and smooth. The first shot broke clean. No hesitation. The recoil impulse was softer than factory loads, the report sharper. She watched the trace arc into the target and saw it punch through dead center. She fired again, and again, 10 rounds in measured rhythm, adjusting for wind, letting the rifle cool just enough between strings, no wasted movement, no second guessing. When she finished, she rolled off the mat and stood, brushing dust from her uniform. Garrett didn't say a word. He just nodded once. The same way he always did when he knew it had gone right. The range officer walked the firing line with a tape measure in hand. He stopped in front of her target, looked, measured, then measured again. He called the group, half-minute of angle. At 600 yards, that meant a cluster, barely 3 inches across. The tightest group of the morning. Whispers moved down the line. Then Holt appeared. He didn't speak right away, just stared at the target. Then at Avery. His eyes narrowed. He asked what ammo she was using. She answered plainly. Hand-loaded. Verified. Approved. He asked again, like he hadn't heard her. She told him the same thing. He followed her back to the staging area, where she showed him the hand press. The scale, the logbook filled with notes and numbers. He picked up the press like he wasn't sure it was real, looked at the worn handle, the old steel, then looked at her. There's no way, he muttered. You can't outshoot government-tested match ammo with this. Avery didn't blink, didn't smirk, just said it flat. I didn't get lucky. I knew what I was doing. I know this rifle. I know every round. And I know that you can't sabotage someone who builds their own edge from scratch. Day 2 brought heavier wind and tougher light. The sun rose over the range just after 6:10 a.m., sharp and bright through low clouds, casting long shadows across the hills. Unknown distance was the challenge on deck. No set range markers, no room for error. Shooters had to spot, range, calculate, and fire all under a strict time limit. It was where good shooters missed, and great teams stayed calm. Avery moved down the course beside Garrett with the steady pace of someone who already knew where her feet would land. Garrett scanned the terrain, noting tree lines, dips in elevation, and how light bent over dry patches of ground. He didn't use a rangefinder, just his eyes, and years of memory from combat deployments that had taught him how to read terrain better than any device could. He called the first target 870. Avery trusted him without asking. She dialed in elevation, then leaned into the scope. Watching the mirage ripple left to right across the berm, she called a slight wind hold and fired. The steel target rang. First shot. One down. That pattern held. Garrett would estimate. Avery would adjust. She watched the angle of the grass, the movement of shadows, even the shimmer off the barrel after each shot. Her breathing stayed calm. Her trigger brake stayed clean. Target after target went down. Almost everyone hit on the first round. She didn't waste motion or time. Her rifle, her data card, and her ammunition, all of it tuned like a system, like a language she didn't have to translate. By the end of the course, they had hit every target. Avery stayed kneeling after the final shot, letting her heart settle as Garrett gave her a small nod. It was the same one he gave when everything worked exactly how it should. Scores went up before noon. The Army team was at the top by a margin that turned heads. The Marines, usually dominant on this stage, had dropped too many targets to catch up. Holt didn't say anything during the debrief. He stood near the back, arms folded, watching the numbers like they might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. Later, when the line had cleared and Avery was checking over her gear, he walked up. No sneer, no posturing, just Kiet. He asked how she made it look so consistent, how she took shots that didn't just land, they struck like they were meant to go nowhere else. She told him the truth. Factory ammo was built to perform across dozens of rifles. Hers was made for one, made to match her chamber, her barrel, her exact point of aim. She didn't trust general solutions. She trusted details. He didn't argue, didn't nod, just stood there for a moment, thoughtful, then turned and walked away with a slower step than usual. Not defeated, just thinking. Respect didn't always come loud. Sometimes it arrived in silence. In the way someone walked away with more questions than they came with, Avery didn't need to win that conversation. She already had. The final day of the competition started just before 7 o'clock in the morning. The sky was clear, but the wind was already shifting. The team course wasn't about standing still and squeezing a perfect shot. It was movement, timed positions, targets that changed distance and speed, wind calls that had to be made in seconds. It was the kind of challenge that exposed cracks in communication and trust. Avery didn't worry about that. She and Garrett moved like they were built from the same plan. He didn't over-explain. She didn't second-guess. He called a range, a hold, a wind shift. She adjusted, breathed, and fired. The targets dropped, one after another. No panics, no wasted motion. She was working inside the system she'd built with her own hands. Rifle, ammo, data, partner. It all lined up. By 10:30 a.m., the course was done. They'd hit every mark and beat the clock by nearly a full minute. The scores weren't even close. When the teams gathered for the awards ceremony that afternoon, the tension that had followed Avery all week finally broke. Captain Miles stepped forward. He didn't just read out names or numbers. He talked about resilience, about adapting when things fall apart. He said anyone could shoot well when everything went right. But what separated the real professionals was what they did when the plan failed. He said the Army team hadn't just won. They had overcome. Avery stood beside Garrett, holding the trophy. Not beaming, just steady. The room applauded. Most of it, in the back, Gunnery Sergeant Holt stood still. He didn't clap, but he didn't leave. 2 days later, Avery was back at the range. checking wind patterns and load notes for her next batch. Holt approached slowly, hands in his pockets. This time, there was no edge in his voice. He said he'd spent 2 decades relying on equipment and assumptions. He said he'd watched her shoot and realized he'd been wrong. Not just about her, about the way he measured readiness. He asked if she'd be willing to teach a class, Marine instructors, handloading basics, the kind of fundamentals you couldn't buy in a box. She said yes. 3 months later, she stood at a long metal table inside a classroom at Quantico. 15 Marine snipers sat in folding chairs, watching her measure powder charges with the same old digital scale her grandfather had used. She explained case prep, seating depth, pressure signs, consistency. She passed around her hand press. Let them feel the weight of it. She told them precision wasn't about having the best tools. It was about knowing how to use what you had and understanding every part of what you built. Now, when Avery walked onto a range, no one asked if she belonged. They asked what she thought of their zero. They handed her rounds and asked for feedback. They called her by name. The sabotage hadn't broken her. It had sharpened her. It hadn't kept her out. It had made her undeniable.